morning, everyone. Good evening, good afternoon, depending on your time zone. I'm Anjuli Shivshanker. I'm the Senior Research Advisor for the Education and Crisis and Conflict team at USAID. And I want to welcome you to the webcast on measuring equity of access to education in conflict and crisis. I'm really excited to hear from our panelists today because we know that in conflict and crisis, inequalities that existed before are heightened, new inequalities are created. And as we program in these settings, we really need to understand who we're serving in our programs, who we aren't serving, and whether our programming is actually getting those kids into school who wouldn't otherwise be there. So in 2016, the Education in Crisis and Conflict Network, or ECCN, looked at the indicators that are used by USAID-funded programs. And they found that though we have quite a few best practices in place, we really weren't adequately capturing equity at all. So today I'm really thrilled that we have presenters who are going to give us actual step-by-step practical guidance for how to capture equity of access to education projects. So the folks we have with us today are Annie Smiley from FHI 360, Fernanda Suarez from FHI 360, and Daniel Levon from EDC. The guidance was developed through a collaboration actually between the Education and Conflict and Crisis Network and the Education Equity Research Initiative, which Annie will actually tell you about in a few minutes. But ECCN is a global community of practice comprised of USAID staff and implementing partners who all work together to increase equitable access to education for children and youth in crisis and conflict-affected environments. The Education Equity Research Initiative was launched in March 2016 and is intended to be a forum for generating evidence around equity in education programs and policies. So before I hand it over to Annie, I just want to take us through the agenda and then do a little bit of housekeeping. So Annie Smiley will tell us a little bit about the research initiative overall. Daniel Levon is then going to take us through what's equity and why is it important to measure equitable access. And then Fernanda Suarez is actually going to go through the 6 steps with us. From there, we'll have a Q&A session. So for all of you, because we keep people on mute during the webinars, please go ahead and put your questions in the chat box. You can do this during the presentation. I'll take notes of the questions that come up, or you can wait until the end. And then we'll go ahead and wrap up. So then without further ado, I will actually go ahead and pass the mic over to Annie.
Thanks, Anjuli. Hi, everyone. This is Annie Smiley of FHI 360. So as Anjuli said, I am going to tell you a little bit about the Education Equity Research Initiative. Basically, as Anjuli already mentioned, the Education Equity Research Initiative was launched in March 2016 by 2 organizations, FHI 360 and Save the Children, but many different organizations come together to work on the Education Equity Research Initiative. The initiative is a vital forum for generating evidence around equity in education policies and programs. And our active participants come from all over the world, from a wide range of organizations and agencies and networks. We aim to collectively build the evidence base. We aim to develop common measurement frameworks around equity. We aim to develop and test hypotheses for strengthening equity in and through education. And we aim to maintain the focus on equity within the Sustainable Development Goals development agenda. So what we do is we really convene conversations and we produce knowledge products. So we currently have task teams that focus on disability, on gender, on social emotional learning, and on equitable education finance. In the past, before some of these task teams were more active, we focused a lot on measurement issues, and you can see some of the products in front of you that were produced mostly under the measurement work stream. We had a paper on mainstreaming equity in education, a paper or a landscape review on equity measurement, and then that led to some practical recommendations for equity analysis in education. So really what I want to do now is hand over to Daniel to tell you more about our newest product, which is focusing on how you can develop equitable access indicators for education in crisis and conflict. So over to you, Daniel.
Thank you very much, Annie, and greetings, everyone. So this guidance is for formulating and developing indicators for measuring equity of access. So we want to begin by quickly giving you some reminders or clarifications, if necessary, about the meanings of the terms equity and access that we have in mind. And I'll start with equity. Often, even today, in discussions of education and other social services, the terms equity and equality are used or get used interchangeably, somewhat carelessly, whereas we believe there's an important distinction conceptually to be made between the two, as this pair of images illustrates. May be a very familiar pair of images for many of you. In the image on the left, all three individuals have received the same support, and as such, they're being treated equally. The incorrect assumption would appear to be that everyone will sufficiently benefit from such equal treatment. In the image on the right, on the other hand, individuals are given different supports to make it possible for them to have an equal access to viewing the game. So they're being treated differently, but in a way that promotes equal opportunity or leveling of the playing field. So applying this principle specifically to equality of educational access and participation, we can understand that the need to pay attention to fundamental inequality of starting conditions and capabilities of particular learners, families, and communities, as well as to systemic barriers that disproportionately affect certain learners, families, and communities. And wherever such unequal starting points and systemic barriers exist, then an equal resource allocation or an equal treatment across all categories of learners typically will not promote equal educational opportunities. That is to say, it generally is not equitable and will not realize the principle of equity. So equity is defined as a distribution of resources in education with the goal of reducing or eliminating systematic inequality of outcomes. So in this sense, equity is a path to achieving equality in outcomes. Next, what do we mean by access? First, I want to clarify that by access, we, in this case, do not mean learning, because measurement of equality and inequality in learning outcomes is a topic for other documents, and indeed, as Annie showed you, the Equity Initiative has previously produced some technical reviews and guidance notes about measuring equity of learning. We, of course, understand that learning is the ultimate outcome of interest for education, but we still believe that it's conceptually important to think through the access issue, as was a focus of USAID Goal 3 in the previous strategy, that first getting kids into some form of schooling is a necessary first step to have the opportunity to learn. And furthermore, measurement of equity of access presents special challenges that are quite separate from those involved in measuring learning outcomes, and that therefore warrant guidance separately on their own. So returning to what we do mean by access, I want to call attention to how we are definitely bringing in aspects of an expanded view of access that were elaborated quite well by the CREATE program that was a consortium for research on educational access, transition, and equity, a DFID-funded program earlier in this decade, that drew attention to how the conventional means of looking at access in terms of enrollment ratios, for example, for the entire primary cycle, tend to mask or to not reveal many important things about the access dynamics in any context. If you look at this simple diagram that I've created here, if you looked at the enrollment ratio for the entire primary 6 years of primary, the average for each of those years comes out to around 52%, it looks like. But that doesn't really tell the whole story about how initial enrollment or intake was near 70%. Retention seems to be an issue as it decreases each year, and the completion rate is only about 40%. So these are definitely aspects of access that we want to take into consideration. The retention, the completion, and then if you look here, the transition to the secondary cycle, as illustrated in the yellow, there's another big drop-off. So this is often an issue in many contexts. And in fact, most of the kids that are excluded from education, even in least developed countries now, it's not the case that they never entered school, but that rather they have dropped out at some point or other due for various reasons. And so CREATE, that I mentioned, has actually done a lot of good analysis on this and created this more in-depth and fine-grained sort of schematic of zones of creation that we very much encourage program developers to use as a way of really trying to analyze what's happening that's causing the inclusion, where are the bottlenecks, and where are the what they call zones of exclusion. Okay, so why develop equity indicators for educational access in conflict and crisis settings? If you're not already kind of convinced that it's a useful thing to do, we also want to call attention to the alignment of this agenda with Sustainable Development Goal 4, whose Target 5 explicitly calls to eliminate gender disparities in education and to ensure equal access to all levels of education, including for persons with disabilities, indigenous peoples, and children in vulnerable situations. And it calls for the use of parity indices for national access reporting, including the ratio of female to male students, the bottom to the top, wealth quintile, etc. And therefore, as I say, explicitly calling attention to how exclusion from education as a lack of access to education does not affect all segments of the population equally, but is rather most often related to individual and group level characteristics and affiliations. In addition, recent research, some of which has been reviewed and pulled together by the Equity Initiative, provides evidence that inequalities in education can definitely increase the risk of conflict, and that experiencing conflict can exacerbate pre-existing education inequality. So to break this vicious cycle of inequality and violent conflicts and take a very conflict-sensitive approach to education programming, it's critical for practitioners to prioritize equitable approaches and to measure change in equity over time. So how have projects been measuring equitable access? So there clearly is growing awareness at the discursive level about the need to promote equitable access and the role of equitable access in a conflict-sensitive approach. As Anjuli mentioned at the top of the webcast, in 2016, so about 2.5 years ago, ECCN did conduct an analysis of project monitoring plans focusing on the indicators that were used in USAID-funded education projects in crisis and conflict environments. And the first key finding was that projects most often were only measuring equity through the disaggregation of indicators on enrollments or of learners supported by the project. In one or more dimensions of equity, typically gender, sometimes urban-rural, and generally there were not targets for the disaggregate components, so not necessarily clear accountability for equity outcomes. And thus it was not surprising that study of the results frameworks in the PMPs revealed that often there were not clear equity promoting activities within these access projects, even if in the narrative there was some language around the importance of equity. Typically, there was only rather kind of a tacit assumption that the overall access interventions may lead to increased equity. This review also showed that for most access indicators were formulated just as raw totals of persons reached without a reference to the underlying population. So simply the number of learners that were reached by the project or that were enrolled in schools that were touched by the project. That's problematic because to truly measure changes in access and therefore changes in equity in terms of different subgroups of the population, you need reference to the actual population figures to know what percentage of that population or subpopulation is getting access to education. And finally, the review highlighted a great need to improve the consistency of measures, both conceptually and methodologically, in terms of indicators across projects. In response to the findings and recommendations of this ECCN report, the Conflicts and Fragility Workstream of the Equity Initiative, in collaboration with ECCN support team, has produced the document that we're presenting today, which provides a process for projects or country missions for developing context-specific indicators to measure equity of access to educational opportunities in conflict and crisis. The guidance emphasizes that patterns of exclusion are very context-specific and that the choice of indicators will depend not only on the equity dimensions that are relevant for that specific context, but on the design and the purpose of the interventions that will be in response to the specific barriers and patterns of exclusion in that context. So that is why, rather than simply developing a list of ready-made indicators, we have formulated this guidance as process for arriving at customized indicators. So I'm now going to turn the presenter's role over to Fernanda to provide detail on the steps of the indicator development guidance. Thanks.
Thank you, Daniel. I will now talk a little bit about each of the 6 steps that we propose as part of the process. So here in this figure, we provide an overview of the entire process. The process basically starts with the identification of relevant equity dimension and the types of access barriers that children face. It's followed by the definition of the intervention based on the access barriers and the equity dimensions previously identified. The next step is then to actually develop the equitable access indicators following a sub-step approach that we propose. Once the indicators are developed, we then conduct a data inventory and quality assessment. Depending on the gaps identified during the data inventory and quality assessment, projects may want to conduct primary data collection as needed and as feasible. The idea is that once all these 5 steps are in place, projects should be able to calculate equitable access indicators on an ongoing basis. In the subsequent slides, I will talk a little bit about each of the sub-steps in details. However, I do want to emphasize that throughout the entire process, we strongly recommend a collaborative approach to indicator development and measurement involving educational authorities, local stakeholders, local community members, other implementing partners, etc., in order to make sure that the equity dimensions that are identified are relevant for that specific context, to promote local ownership of the indicators and subsequent use of these indicators for purposes of decision making. So the first step is about identifying equity dimensions, and it can serve a double purpose. It can inform project design and strategies to improve access, as well as to inform the development of equitable access indicators. As Daniel was mentioning in the beginning, children that are excluded from the education system, they do not come from all segments of the population equally. And children that come from the most marginalized and most vulnerable population subgroups, they do tend to face disproportionately higher levels of exclusion from education. So the idea here is that the first sub-step in this process is to identify these vulnerable population subgroups that are most likely to include children that are out of school or at risk of sporadic attendance and or of dropping out. We're in the process of developing a questionnaire to be applied to different members of the local population through a participatory research approach to support donors and implementing partners in identifying these vulnerable population subgroups. I think it's also important to highlight that to the extent possible, this initial analysis should be embedded and fully incorporated into initial educational needs assessments, as well as situation assessments, such as the Rapid Education Risk Analysis, the RERA. Also, given constant population shifts and movements in crisis and conflict contexts, it's also important that this analysis is embedded in rolling approach throughout the life cycle of the project. The second sub-step in this process is to clearly define the demographic categories of the population subgroups identified. In a way, this kind of naturally emerged from step 1, but we also want to make explicit and purposeful that projects should have the demographic categories very explicitly defined. So for instance, projects may find that population subgroups excluded from the education system might be related to equity dimensions such as gender, displacement, ethnicity, language, etc. Or it might be the case in case of multiple exclusion factors that there is an intersection between these different demographic categories. The third sub-step in this process is about building a profile of out-of-school children and the types of barriers to accessing education they face. We need to understand, for instance, if the children that are out of school, do they ever enter school and then dropped out? Do they enter and completed primary education, but then they fail to transition to secondary education? Or do they enter school and then they drop out soon after initial entry? Or are they enrolled but at risk of dropping out? So these are all things that we need to fully understand in order to build this profile. So Daniel presented the Zones of Exclusion model, which is a model that we recommend the projects use in building the profile of out-of-school children. We also aim to support projects by developing a tool that can ask local population members about reasons for attendance, non-attendance, irregular attendance, as well as about perceptions of quality and benefits of schooling. The second step in our overall process is to identify interventions that increase access based on the equity dimensions and the barriers that were identified in step 1. So to support projects in this process, we have developed an intervention matrix that can inform project design. The idea with the intervention matrix is that it can inform which intervention is most suited to promoting access or retention based on the specific barriers that were previously defined, as well as on the equity dimensions that were identified. So here in this slide, we provide a snapshot of the intervention matrix, but also I wanted to highlight that the matrix is available at the Equity Initiative website. So here I provide the web link where you can access and download the matrix and fully explore the interactive features. I also want to mention that the intervention matrix, it's a conceptual analysis, a conceptual exercise, and it's really not intended to be a systematic review of the evidence available. The third step in the overall process is about actually developing the equitable access indicators. Equitable access indicators, they aim to measure inequalities among different subgroups in a society, which is also known as horizontal inequalities. So to support projects in this process, we developed this 4 sub-steps approach. The idea is that first, projects identify the root access or retention indicator for customization. The choice of root access or retention indicator should be based on the project objective and on the project theory of change. So, for instance, a project that promotes social and emotional learning within schools may want to focus on retention indicators, whereas a project that is distributing scholarships for out-of-school children may want to focus on enrollment rates. Then the second sub-step in this process is about applying the equity dimensions that was previously identified in step 1, making it very explicit as this equity dimension is going to be integrated into the formulation of the indicator. The third sub-step in this process is about choosing the equity metrics. There are few equity metrics available. We recommend the use of equity metrics known as gaps or parity ratios because these metrics, they tend to be easier to calculate and they're more intuitive in terms of their interpretation. Gaps and parity index, they compare 2 groups with different levels of education access. For instance, it can be applied to compare education access for male and female. It's also possible to apply gaps and parity ratios to equity dimensions that involve 3 or more groups. Let's say the case of ethnicity or local language, where there might be 3 or more ethnic groups or 3 or more local language. But in this case, in order to apply the gaps or parity ratio, we would be comparing 2 groups of interest, not necessarily the largest groups. We could also compare 1 dominant group versus all the minority groups combined. We can compare 1 group of interest versus the national average, let's say. And then the 4th sub-step in this process is about combining all the 3 elements that we have just revealed in order to formulate and draft the indicator for equitable access. So here we provide a concrete and practical example based on hypothetical data on how we can apply these 4 different sub-steps to develop equitable access indicators. So, for instance, here on sub-step 1, which is about the choice of access or retention measure, we have a gross enrollment rate. In the sub-step 2, about identifying equity dimension, we highlight displacement, which is a common equity of interest in many crisis and conflict-affected contexts. In terms of equity metrics, we have a gap. So once we combine these 3 elements, we can formulate our custom indicator as gaps in primary gross enrollment rates by displacement status. In terms of calculating this indicator, in the second table, we have hypothetical data. So the first thing that we need to do is calculate gross enrollment rate for each subgroup. So we calculate gross enrollment rate for the non-displaced, and we calculate gross enrollment rate for the displaced population. So in this case, we have 83% for non-displaced and 25% for the displaced. And then we calculate the gap between the two, which in this case is 58%, which means that gross enrollment rate for the displaced would have to be increased by 58 percentage points in order for equality to be achieved, in order for equality in education access to be achieved between the two groups. One key point of this exercise is that by combining different access and retention measures based on the project objectives and theory of change with different equity dimensions, their context and they're relevant for that specific context, with different equity metrics, there are a number of indicators that we can formulate with this approach. In the document and here in this slide, I provide a snapshot of a table which provides illustrative indicators that can be formulated using this process, and that might be relevant for projects operating in crisis and conflict settings. Once the indicators are developed, the idea is to conduct a data inventory and quality assessment. This is a step that any project that is relying on secondary data sources would conduct, but I would say it's especially relevant for projects operating in crisis and conflict context, given the issues with data availability and data reliability. So to support projects in their data inventory, the guidance document provides a list of traditional data sources as well as population estimate sources that projects can rely on. One recommendation that may be very specific for projects operating in crisis and conflict contexts is to reach out to humanitarian agencies as non-traditional data sources. We know that in crisis and conflict context, there are constant population movements and population shifts. So here we have the formula that's most frequently adopted to define the total population, which includes all population living in the boundaries of the country, plus all population that has entered the boundaries of the country from another origin, minus all population that has left the country. And as we all know, this total population figure can be very volatile in crisis and conflict context. Humanitarian agencies, they're often collecting ongoing data to calculate population estimates. They apply a number of alternative methods, which we cover some in the guidance document, to estimate reference population numbers. It can be extremely helpful to fill out gaps that might have been found in the inventory, on the data inventory. It can also be very useful to obtain current and real data on population estimates, and in harmonizing figures with that of other organizations. One example to highlight here is the displacement tracking matrix by the IMO, which established a very comprehensive system to collecting and analyzing data on the number of IDPs, and sometimes as well as on their demographic profile. The following sub-step in this process is to conduct a data quality assessment. We provide some questions in the guidance document to guide projects in this data quality assessment. One thing to highlight and to pay special attention is the ability of the different data sources, or the possibility within these different data sources to disaggregate the data on the equity dimensions of interest. Very often, administrative data sources, such as education management information systems, they may not have data that might be disaggregated on the equity dimensions that may be of interest to the project. For example, ethnicity and language. Household surveys, on the other hand, they might be able to provide more possibilities in terms of disaggregation. So that's one of the things to pay attention for in the data quality assessment process, as well as other factors that we highlight in the guidance document. Depending on the gaps that are identified as part of the data inventory and quality assessment, projects may want and may need to conduct primary data collection as feasible. I say as feasible because a lot of times there might not be enough resources for primary data collection, or local security conditions may not allow. Where population data is available, but administrative or school data is not, it might be helpful to conduct a school survey in order to collect data on the number of enrollments. And that can complement the administrative data in calculating certain access indicators. Where data is not at all available or not reliable, projects may want to conduct a household survey, which are sample-based surveys that survey a cross-section of the population. There are specific sampling methods that we cover a little bit that can be applied to improve access to hard-to-reach populations, which is often the case with the populations that we identify as vulnerable and marginalized. And this method can be extremely helpful to monitor school access for the disadvantaged groups that were identified in the sub-step approach. Once steps 1 through 5 are in place, as I mentioned in the beginning, projects should be able to calculate equitable access indicators on an ongoing basis. In addition to calculating the indicators on an ongoing basis, we strongly recommend for dissemination of the indicator performance to appropriate audience, as well as to promoting reflection and incorporation of the findings into improved programming. But what if data on population estimates is not at all available? Then we propose that projects adopt 2 separate indicators, two separate indicators for each relevant equity dimension that should be used in conjunction and not separately. So, for example, here we have number of host community persons benefiting from USG-supported education services, and number of forcibly displaced persons benefiting from USG-supported education services. By defining 2 separate indicators as opposed to 1 indicator that could be potentially disaggregated, in this case, by displacement status, our approach is to encourage projects to consider existing access barriers faced by both groups, the non-displaced and the displaced in this case, to explicitly and purposefully address them and to measure progress towards overcoming them. In this specific case, to derive data for the 2 indicators proposed, projects can utilize EMIS or other national data when available, if also these data sets can be disaggregated on the equity dimension of interest, or they can conduct their own survey of schools or learning centers. One main limitation, obviously, of this approach is that since it does not reference the underlying population, we cannot claim that they're measuring change education access rates for the population. Just a few concluding remarks after showing the 6 steps as well as some proposed indicators. This guidance is applicable to developing countries in general, but it attempts to address challenges that are specific to crisis and conflict. The idea is that the approach is flexible and can be adapted to each project as well as to context-specific equity dimensions. The approach proposed should be ongoing, as I mentioned in the beginning, and to the extent possible, embedded interrolling assessment, given constant change in population shifts in conflict and crisis settings. Thank you. I will now turn it over to Anjuli.
Thanks, Fernanda. So we have a couple of questions in the chat. I encourage everyone, if you go down to the bottom right of your screen, you'll see a chat box that you can type in your questions, and I'll go ahead and surface those to our panelists. So Fernanda, could you talk a little bit more about what formative work needs to be done in order to choose the equity dimensions? Certainly, they are context specific, but if you're looking at an indicator that's at a project level, what would you recommend looking at? And actually, I realized I need to assure you're the presenter so that you can actually flip through the slides.
I think we talk a lot about in steps 1, especially in step 1, in working through participatory approach with the local population in order to identify population subgroups there are the population subgroups that tend to be excluded from the education system. In that specific context, that would be the equity dimension of interest. And that equity dimension that is defined locally with the local population is the equity dimension that we would then include into the equitable access indicator of interest. I think it's key that the equitable access indicator is very clearly formulated to potentially avoid any type of bias in the future, and to be very clear to all stakeholders involved exactly what it is that we are measuring.
Okay, thank you.
Can I just add something, Anjuli?
Yes.
Sure. So, yeah, I think Fernanda had initially mentioned that the sorts of research into determining the most crucial equity dimensions in a project could be worked into like a rapid education risk assessment, so the RERA that ECCN has developed, and that is increasingly sort of required, I think, by USAID, or some sort of situation analysis, conflict analysis in the early stages of a project startup, to make sure that you're really getting an accurate picture of what the dynamics are between groups that might have been party to some kind of conflict, whether it's ongoing or in the past. And so I think that's a really important thing to be doing, and that kind of thing also can take place in the program design stage at the mission level, right? There should be a lot of, I think, analysis of that before a program is even being awarded. There should be already background knowledge on what are the key equity dimensions at play within the context.
Yeah, that is a great point. And I think building on that a little bit, actually, so we have a question from Ash, and he asks, what do you actually mean by measuring constant change of equity dimensions in a population base or beneficiaries if you're in a context like South Sudan or northeastern Nigeria? So it's one question. And then his second, which I think also builds a little bit, Daniel and Fernando, on what you began talking about, but it is often politically sensitive to gather data on groups that are traditionally excluded, right? Especially when the dynamics of the conflict or crisis are driven by ethnicity, for example. So how would you recommend negotiating data collection with national or local authorities? I know at the very end, you guys kind of noted that if it's not possible actually to get the core data you need to calculate the indicator, you have those two other options, but it doesn't allow you to measure change over time. So maybe kind of talking about the calculus that you recommend folks do in order to figure out whether they can really answer this equity question and look at the change in equity over time.
Did you want to go first, Fernanda, on the first question? I want to make sure I understood the first question. But
yes, I can try to address the first question a little bit. I think the idea here is that, as we know, in crisis and conflict settings, everything is changing constantly. So one thing is that we have constant population movements, people coming in, people going in and out, and that might be affected by the nature of the conflict, as well as change in the conflict situation. And that might also impact the population subgroups that are excluded from the education system. So there is this constant interaction between like the education and the conflict. So I think the idea here would be like incorporating this analysis into an ongoing manner, so we know how is the conflict shaping and how is that affecting the exclusion from the education system. The idea is that the project is constantly up to date on all of these factors.
This is Annie. Just to add to that, I think Fernanda mentioned this briefly, but ideally our rolling assessments will continuously update the rapid education and risk analysis findings, and the findings from really understanding those equity dimensions and those barriers to access. And we've found that in a lot of the sort of deep humanitarian crises and situations where we work, such as the ones you mentioned, Ash, there's a lot more data than we realize that's available from these humanitarian organizations. And, it's updated often, even on a weekly basis, on, every 2 weeks or even, every month, depending on the volatility of the conflict context. So what we recommend in terms of rolling assessments is often secondary data. So not necessarily doing primary data collection, although we obviously encourage that as well when there are gaps. But trying to find, innovative ways of making sure that we're capturing secondary data and also primary data using technology or other means to really understand how conflict dynamics are changing, how exclusion is changing, what new issues are at play. So keeping that risk analysis updated will really help. And then, sometimes our equity indicators might change, and I think that's part of complexity-aware monitoring and adaptive management and being flexible with how we think about our outcomes and our theories of change on these kinds of programs in really challenging environments. So just a few thoughts.
I'll go ahead and talk about the second question because I think it's really important, and I'm glad you brought it up. Certainly, attention to equity is valuable in itself, just for the purpose of equity. But it's, as we talked about, a big part of being conflict sensitive in programming in these areas to make sure that there aren't grievances brewing over what perceived unequal allocations of resources and unfairness. Since you're paying attention to equity in the service of being conflict sensitive, the last thing you'd want to do is, through the data collection that's meant to serve equity, do something that is not sensitive to the conflict, that could put people at risk because of lack of confidentiality, of data, of identifying people, giving them identity markers that become public, etc. So I think it's a really important issue. And I think we do have some mention in the document that we would definitely advise people to immerse themselves in the finer details of conflict sensitivity and conflict sensitive monitoring and data collection, much of which is available in INEE guidance and the whole toolkit that they have and training that's available for them. I think on the INEE website there's now a online training tool as well as all of the various resources to think through the very important issues about what the implications are of data collection for conflict sensitivity. So thanks for bringing that up.
Great, thank you all. Another question that came up is, so certainly could you situate a little bit these steps in the kind of larger program cycle? And then what are your kind of observations or best advice about the way we look at M&E budgets or staffing in order to make space for this work?
I think the M&E staff and budget implications will highly depend on the data inventory and quality assessment and the availability of secondary data sources and reliability of these data sources, as well as the potential of these data sources to disaggregate on the equity dimensions of interest. So assuming there is available and reliable secondary data sources that the project can rely on and primary data collection is not necessarily needed, then obviously we have minor implications in terms of budget and staffing. But to the extent that these sources are not available or they do not attend the needs of the project, then primary data collection, as we all know, does have huge implications in terms of budget as well as in terms of project staffing. I think to the extent possible to minimize those implications, if it's possible to incorporate data collections into ongoing data collections that the project has already planned, that can minimize certain budgetary implications, and also to the extent possible to involve system actors, education system actors into the data collection process and the Ministry of Education. So it's something sustainable. It also can minimize certain budget implications. We talked, for instance, a little bit about in the first step about embedding the analysis of population subgroups excluded from the education system into initial education needs assessments as well as rolling assessments. So I guess to the extent possible, that would be our recommendation. I don't know if Daniel and you have anything to complement.
Yeah, I would just, you've said it already, Fernanda, but the real cost is probably if you need to do household surveys. Most of the time we have access to the schools and learning centers where we're working, so collecting data in there is probably happening anyway. But it's the household surveys where that can get really expensive and difficult. And so I think what we're saying, what we'd like to recommend is, really make sure that someone else isn't already doing that, because there's a lot of different data collection activities happening in these environments that are not necessarily in the education sector that can give us a lot of good information. And a lot of times, education colleagues, and we tend to be sometimes more development oriented, or we tend to not realize that this humanitarian infrastructure exists in the education sector as well as outside of the education sector, and there's a lot of information out there. So we're not saying go out and do lots of household surveys. I think that's kind of a last resort if the budget allows, and it probably wouldn't necessarily allow. There was also a question about how this fits in the program cycle, and I think, Fernanda talked about that a bit as well. I think the 6 steps encompass the entire program cycle from design of the intervention. So I think that's where we get into, donors and funders really thinking before they design a program about equity groups and how programs are going to, really address equity challenges within the design of the program. So it really comes majorly into the design question. And then in terms of when data collection happens, I would most of the time we're reporting these indicators to our donors, on an annual basis, maybe sometimes on a quarterly basis, depending on the indicator. So we'd want to have data collection in place, especially in a conflict-infected environment, probably more frequently, especially when things are changing all the time. So just, regular data collection, as I mentioned, sometimes data is even available every week. So I'm not saying that necessarily needs to be the frequency, but it really does. I think when we say rolling assessments and this constant updating of information, we really do mean at the pace of change of the environment. So if it's really dynamic, then data collection should be happening more frequently, even if it's secondary data collection. So I guess it fits into all phases of the program cycle. I think that's what I would end with. Would everyone agree?
Very much so, yeah. And I would just add to that, I think that, yeah, to the extent that within a country program, thinking maybe, for example, in a USAID framework, if equity really is a priority, if you really want to take it seriously, then you'd have to think through what might be the implications for the resources we need to give to M&E for this project, if that's what we really want this project to be about. And so I think that, it starts there as far upstream as possible, thinking through, if equity of access is a real priority here. And then I think it's always going to be an iterative process. I mean, I think as we see on any project where indicator development starts with what you might find in a solicitation that's been, proposed. And as we saw in the steps, for example, we bring together steps that have you do a lot of analysis and come up with an indicator. And then the next step says, let's look at what population data is available. And so at that stage, you might decide that what you had designed as an indicator might not be workable because of the issues of the population data. So as in any situation, there's always going to have to be sort of iterations of going back and seeing what can work. But as I say, I think it's really important to think through, if this is a real priority, then resources can, as far upstream as possible, be dedicated to making sure that it can be something that we can really measure if we want to really move the needle on improving equity.
Yes, those are great points. And I think, we have a couple more questions that came in the chat. So there is one question in Spanish that I think, my Spanish is not great. So Fernanda, I'll ask you if you can also take a look at it. I think Marco is asking, is education an actual factor in reducing conflict? Or is it just something that serves as a placebo that just kind of lets the conflict keep on rolling, and as long as people can send their kids to school, they're happy? That's a big question. So yeah, I'll turn that over to the panelists.
I think there has been some recent research by FHI 360 and UNICEF that indeed provides evidence that rising inequalities in education can increase the risk of conflict, but also that experiencing conflict can exacerbate pre-existing education inequality. So there is this ongoing relationship. There is also the recognition that other contextual risks and factors, such as gang-related violence, natural hazards, insecurity, health emergencies, they may impact education and may increase inequality. And also that education itself might exacerbate or mitigate its risks. So to break the cycle of inequality, the idea is that we should be conflict sensitive in our approach to education programs, to education programming, and also to prioritize equitable approach to measure change over time. I think this is a great question. I would strongly recommend to look at the research that FHI 360 and UNICEF has done that kind of looks a little bit into this relationship. Daniel, anything to complement?
No, I think that's right. And I know that paper is available. I think it's called, if someone else is on the line and wants to type it in, but it's the horizontal relationship between education inequality and violent conflict. And it's available on epdc.org, the Education Policy and Data Center. So definitely worth looking at that research, which was done with a massive data set, a global data set spanning 50 years of data, of education and conflict data, looking at that relationship. So that's a strong argument for the fact that education is actually really closely associated with conflict. I would just add one other thing that's a little bit unrelated, but I think is also important. So it was alluded to at the beginning of this webinar that we're focusing on access, and that learning really is a key outcome when it comes to education, as we all know, and that inequality of learning is also really important. And the Education Equity Research Initiative has done a lot of work looking at really how we measure inequality within education programs, looking at learning data sets primarily. And the fact that a lot of one-size-fits-all approaches to improving learning can actually end up exacerbating inequalities in education if they're not scaffolded to make sure that those who need the most support get the most support. So basically, we have not neglected the quality side. If you look at the broader picture of what's happening in the Education Equity Research Initiative and other initiatives as well. But if you go and look at some of the other work on practical recommendations for measuring equity within education programs, we also have a structured questions analytical tool to make sure that if you have a learning data set, that you can do analysis on it to really understand the extent to which the program is improving or reducing gaps in education versus actually increasing them. So there's a lot of work to be done within education programs, as well as the work that we're doing right now, which is really talking about the access side.
Great, thanks. So we have just about 2 more minutes before I hand back to Annie, so we'll take one more question. So this question links to the key organizational capacity, so beyond technical skills, which I think the panelists have talked to us a little bit about already, but what are the key organizational capacities that are needed to actually program for equity to access in a conflict and crisis setting, versus doing the same type of programming in a development setting?
That's a good question. So key organizational capacities for specific to the humanitarian setting?
Yes, the question. Yeah, it says key organizational capacities needed for this type of programming versus conducting an education program in a non-conflict context.
I feel like Anjuli would be the best place to answer that with your background.
I mean, one of the things.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Daniel.
I was just going to quickly say, I think increasingly we should be looking at like conflict sensitivity as an organizational capacity, right, in which, entire staffs are trained and it's built into organizational procedures and protocols. So to me, that would be a big one.
Yeah, I would also add things like your safety and security function usually has a much stronger, you're looking at people who can understand safety and security in the context of your programs, not just pure ops people, but people who understand the intersection between ops and programs. You need essentially, if you're procuring things, if you're paying for things, you need departments that understand how to still maintain best practice accountability, but in a scenario where you might not have full access, or you might have, people who can do scenario planning is another one. And then people, I think, who know the humanitarian system, I mean, Annie mentioned this a little bit previously, right? But there is often a massive humanitarian infrastructure, especially if the cluster system has been activated, that is in place. And there's a very specific way of working. And I think when we look at the World Humanitarian Summit and the new way of working, that we're supposed to be attempting to bridge the gap between humanitarian development practice, people who are familiar with the way that each side works, often bring a lot to the team at a senior management level, for example. And I think actually, in addition to that question, when I think about the amount that you have to do if you're subbing to people who are actually delivering the services, that's a whole additional layer of complexity. But I will, and actually I'll try and think if there's other resources. There are a couple more questions in the chat, and a couple of people have helpfully posted links to some of the resources that our panelists have referenced. And before I turn it over to Annie, actually, I'll just mention that today's slides and recording will be published on the ECCN website, as well as I think the ECCN website, and the resources will also be published there as well in the next week or so. So Annie, off to you to take us home.
Thank you. Sorry, let me just switch the slide. So thank you so much, Anjuli, and thank you to our amazing authors of this paper and to our panelists, Fernanda and Daniel. We want you to know that the guidance is now officially posted in 2 different places. You can find it on the educationequity2030.org. That's our Education Equity Research Initiative website. You can also find it on ECCN Network or eccnetwork.net. So you can see those links in front of you, and I think they will also pop up in the chat box since I don't think you can cut and paste from this slide. If you're interested in the Education Equity Research Initiative, you can go to the website mentioned above, educationequity2030.org, and you can join the Conflict and Fragility Workstream. Now, the initial work of that workstream was producing this guidance, and that guidance is, well, it's now complete, but we have plenty of work to do to actually pilot the tools and improve the guidance as people start using it. So if you're interested in doing that, in using the equity indicators and piloting some of these tools and sharing some of your tools for doing this work, please let us know and join our Conflict and Fragility workstream. In addition, we have a new work stream that's just starting up on teacher well-being and social emotional learning, and that's under the Education Equity Research Initiative as well. So if you're interested in that, I think that that is going to be a whole new work stream, a whole new interesting area of work that we're looking for. Well, we already have a pretty solid group, but we're always looking for more interest and more support for that particular tasking. So let me know if you're interested, or please reach out to us via the educationequity2030.org website. And then finally, ECCN, as everyone knows, has great resources on related topics to this. So there are SLE indicators, which is Safer Learning Environments indicators, that are now up and available. Oh, sorry, coming soon, not yet available, and but soon. And then there's also CSE indicators, which is our conflict-sensitive education indicators. And Daniel, I believe, is a key point person for both of those resources. But you'll be able to see updates on those as well as the resources themselves on the ECCN website. Thank you so much for joining. You can see all of our information here, website, social media, Twitter handles, everything here. We're really glad that all of you took the time to join us for this hour this morning, and we look forward to hearing from you. Thanks very much.